There is a company whose products are almost certainly in your refrigerator right now that you have never heard of. It supplies close to a quarter of all United States grain exports and about a fifth of the domestic meat market. And in its most recently completed fiscal year, it reported more revenue than the entire economy of Angola, a nation of more than 30 million people. It has never sold a single share of stock to the public, never held an earnings call, and never filed a quarterly report with the securities regulator. The company is Cargill. The paradox at being illegal. It is that a business large enough to move the price of the food an entire country eats has spent a century and a half arranging its affairs so that almost nobody outside it has to think about it at all. This episode is about how a 19th century grain warehouse in rural Iowa became one of the largest companies on the planet, how the same family has kept control of it for more than 140 years without ever selling it to the public, and what happens on the rare occasions this company does end up in a courtroom. Cargill was founded in 1865 in Conover, Iowa. The business was not glamorous. It was a single grain storage warehouse, the kind of flatboat and elevator operation that dotted the American Midwest as railroads and river barges began moving harvests to market. Cargill's insight was not a new product. It was infrastructure. Farmers needed somewhere to store grain between harvest and sale, and somebody needed to manage the risk of prices moving in the meantime. Cargill built that somewhere and learned to manage that risk one elevator at a time. The company grew the way infrastructure grows. Slowly, then everywhere. In 1875, it moved its base to La Crosse, Wisconsin. By 1890, its Minneapolis grain operation had been incorporated as the Cargill Elevator Company, putting down roots in what would become its permanent home region. The expansion did not stop at the water's edge. In 1923, the company opened its first East Coast offices in New York, and between 1928 and 1930, it expanded into Canada, Europe, and Latin America. A grain warehouse business had become a multinational trading company within 2 generations of its founding, without ever changing the basic thing it did, standing between farmers and the markets that needed what farmers grew. The next expansion came through acquisition and diversification rather than geography. In 1945, Cargill purchased Nutrena Feeds, moving the company further into the business of feeding livestock, not just trading the grain that livestock eat. By 1972, Cargill sales had reached $5 billion, and the company had become, by that measure, the largest agricultural trading company in the world. It had taken a little more than a century to go from one grain elevator in Iowa to the top of an entire global industry, almost entirely outside the public eye, because there had never been a stock price to track or a quarterly call to dial into. In 1979, Cargill made a move that changed what kind of company it was. It acquired MBPXL, a meat processing operation, and entered the beef business directly. This was not a small adjacent step. Grain trading and meat packing are different businesses with different risks, different labor forces, and a much more direct relationship to the physical food supply. The division was renamed Excel in 1982, and in 2004 it was renamed again, this time to Cargill Meat Solutions, folding the company's own name directly onto a business that had started life under 3 other names. Cargill is now, by its own public description and by outside industry accounting, among the largest beef processors on earth, processing more than 7 million cattle every year. Combined with its historic grain trading business, this meant Cargill was no longer simply a company that moved commodities between other companies. It had become a company that touched the actual physical journey of food from farm to package, at a scale few competitors could match. In the fiscal quarter that ended in February 2008, the scale of that combined business was large enough that Cargill's quarterly profits exceeded $1 billion for the first time in the company's history, reaching about $1.03 billion in a single quarter. This was a single financial quarter's profit, not a year's, from a company that had started with one grain elevator less than a century and a half earlier. And yet, even then, most Americans buying meat or bread at a grocery store had no particular reason to know Cargill's name, because nothing about the transaction in front of them said so. That is not an accident. It is the second half of the story, and it may be the more interesting half. Cargill has never gone public. Descendants of William Cargill and his son-in-law, John Macmillan, have owned common equity in the company for more than 140 years, spanning 5 generations, and by 2019, 23 family members together owned 88% of the entire company. A private company of this size has no obligation to publish detailed quarterly earnings, no obligation to hold a call with stock analysts, no obligation to disclose the internal numbers that a public company its size would be required to release 4 times a year. It answers, in the most direct legal sense, to its own family shareholders rather than to public markets. This is not a loophole or an oversight. It is a deliberate, generations-long structure, and it separates ownership from operation in a specific, documented way. Whitney McMillan, who led the company as chairman and chief executive from 1976 to 1995, was the last member of the Cargill or McMillan families to actually run the company day to day. In the mid-1990s, family factions reached an agreement, written into the company's own bylaws, that only 6 of the 17 seats on Cargill's board would be reserved for family members, 4 for McMillan's and 2 for Cargill. Owned the company without managing it, leaving the operating decisions to professional executives instead. Public companies trade transparency for access to public capital. Cargill's owners have made the opposite trade for a century and a half. Less visibility, in exchange for never having to answer to anyone outside the family about how the company is run, quarter to quarter. The result is a company whose products most people have eaten, in some form, within the last week, run by a family whose name draws far less recognition than the products it makes possible. The scale involved is difficult to grasp in the abstract, so it helps to put a number next to it. In its most recently completed fiscal year, ending in May, Cargill reported revenues of $154 billion, a figure that had actually declined from $160 billion the year before, driven by falling crop prices and a multi-year drought that had pushed the United States cattle herd to its smallest size since the 1950s. Even after that decline, Cargill retained its position, for the 5th consecutive year and the 38th time in the last 40 years, at the top of the annual Forbes ranking of America's largest private companies. In December 2024, as that pressure on profits set in, the company announced it would cut about 5% of its global workforce, roughly 8,000 jobs, as part of a broader restructuring the company said was meant to realign its talent and resources with its strategy. It is a strange kind of headline. A company most of the country cannot name laying off thousands of people, in a round of cuts most of the country will also never hear about. To put $154 billion in perspective, gross domestic product estimates place Angola, a country of more than 30 million people, at approximately $152 billion and Slovakia, a member of the European Union, at approximately $169 billion. A single American company, owned by one extended family, sits in revenue terms almost exactly between the annual economic output of those two nations. Cargill now employs roughly 155,000 people. It supplies close to a quarter of all United States grain exports and about a fifth of the domestic meat market, according to the company's own reporting and independent industry tracking. And food is not even the limit of what it touches. The company's own description of its business lines runs from agricultural services and crop and livestock trading to food production, health and pharmaceutical ingredients, industrial and financial risk management, and raw materials more broadly. None of those numbers requires a subscription to a financial data terminal to find. They simply require someone to go looking, which most people reasonably never do. For most of its history, that has been the entire story. Quiet, enormous, largely uneventful growth. But a company this large, touching this much of the global food supply, does occasionally end up somewhere it cannot control quite as easily as its own balance sheet. A courtroom. In 2021, the Supreme Court of the United States heard a case formally titled Nestle USA Inc v. Doe, with a companion case captioned Cargill Incorporated v. Doe. 6 people who said they had been trafficked as children and enslaved on cocoa plantations in Côte d'Ivoire alleged that Nestle and Cargill had encouraged the use of child slave labor by supporting farmers there through capital investments in equipment, training, and cash advances. The claims were brought under the Alien Tort Statute, an old federal law that gives federal courts jurisdiction over lawsuits filed by foreign nationals for violations of international law, allowing foreign nationals in some circumstances to seek remedies in United States courts for human rights violations committed outside the country. The Supreme Court did not rule on whether the abuse the plaintiffs described actually occurred. In an 8-1 decision, the justices ruled on a narrower procedural question: whether the case could proceed at all under that particular statute, given that the law was not meant to apply to conduct occurring entirely outside the United States. The case was sent back on that jurisdictional ground. The underlying allegations were never resolved on their merits in that proceeding. 2 years later, in 2023, a Brazilian court took a narrower and more concrete action, fining Cargill the equivalent of $120,185 over its use of child labor in cocoa harvesting inside Brazil. In 2024, Cargill agreed to pay $30 million to settle a separate class action lawsuit, this one alleging that Cargill had colluded with other beef producers to suppress the wages paid to workers in the meatpacking industry. And in December 2025, a federal court granted preliminary approval to a settlement in which Cargill agreed to pay $32.5 million, and rival processor Tyson Foods agreed to pay $55 million, addressing a class action brought by consumers who alleged the country's largest beef processors had conspired to limit the supply of beef and inflate grocery store prices. The pandemic surfaced this same scale in a different, less legal, more human way. During the COVID-19 outbreak, a single Cargill meat processing plant in High River, Canada, was linked to more than 358 cases of infection among workers, a reminder that behind every figure about millions of older on a production line, doing work that does not stop simply because a virus is spreading through the building. None of these settlements amounts to a criminal conviction, and in each of the settled cases, resolving the litigation is not the same as a court finding that the underlying conduct occurred exactly as alleged. But taken together, they describe a pattern. A company operating at a scale large enough to touch cocoa farms in West Africa, meatpacking plants across the American Midwest and Canada, and grocery store shelves nationwide, occasionally finds that scale translated into court dockets and public health reports with real names and real numbers attached, even while the company itself remains almost entirely outside the public conversation the rest of the year. There is something genuinely strange about a company this size being this anonymous. Enron chased attention, courting magazine covers and innovation awards even while its books were fraudulent. WeWork's founder was marketed as a visionary, right up until the paperwork proved otherwise. Even Blockbuster, in its final years, working. Cargill has done none of that. It has simply gone on doing what it has done since 1865. Standing between the farm and the table, taking a share of the value that passes through its hands, and answering only to the family that owns it. Every other company in this series eventually had a moment where the public was forced to look at it, a fraud unraveling, a stock collapsing, a founder resigning. Cargill has had settlements and a Supreme Court case, but it has never had that single moment, the one that turns a name into a headline everyone remembers. It has simply kept growing, one fiscal year at a time, largely off the public's radar. That is not, by itself, a story of wrongdoing. Most of Cargill's history involved doing exactly what a grain and food company is supposed to do, at a scale that eventually made it essential infrastructure for feeding a large part of the world, the same way a handful of unnoticed pipelines or shipping routes tend to become essential infrastructure without ever becoming household names. But infrastructure this large inevitably touches the lives of an enormous number of people who never chose to be part of. A farmer in Côte d'Ivoire, a line worker in a meatpacking plant, a family paying a grocery bill that quietly reflects decisions made in boardrooms they will never see. Being invisible does not mean being separate from those lives. It just means most of those lives never learn whose decisions they were living inside. It is also worth noting that the fortune this company has generated does not always stay invisible forever, even when the company does. Margaret Anne Cargill, a granddaughter of the founder, spent much of her life almost entirely out of public view, giving away more than $200 million during her lifetime while working to keep her own name out of the transactions. When she died in 2006, her Cargill holdings went to fund 2 charitable trusts that, combined today, hold assets in excess of $9.2 billion, ranking among the 10 largest foundations in the United States. Money built quietly, inside a company that has spent a century and a half avoiding public attention, can still end up doing something very public with itself, once it finally leaves the family's private balance sheet. One note before we close. This episode describes documented corporate history, public financial reporting, and the outcomes of specific legal proceedings and settlements. Where a case was resolved through settlement rather than a trial verdict, that distinction is preserved throughout, and nothing here is investment advice or a claim about what any individual or company privately believed. So here is the question for the comments. Is a company's size and reach something the public has a right even when that company has gone through no fraud, no bankruptcy, and no scandal severe enough to make headlines on its own? Or is privacy, for a company just as for a person, still a legitimate choice, even at a scale of $154 billion a year? I want to read where you land on this one. And in the next episode, we look at a company that chose the exact opposite path. Instead of staying invisible, it became the most recognized retailer in America, turned the mail order catalog into a nationwide institution. Then, within a single generation, it forgot how any of that had worked in the first place. That story is next.